Imagine picking up the phone in your kitchen on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. You expect it to be a telemarketer or maybe a neighbor asking about a missing package. But when you press the receiver to your ear, there is only a heavy rhythmic breathing on the other end. Then a voice you have come to recognize speaks. It is low, raspy, and completely devoid of any human warmth. The voice tells you that it is watching your daughter right now. It describes what she is wearing down to the color of her shoes. Then it whispers a promise. It tells you that it is going to get her alone, and when it does, it is going to cut her into bits. This is not a movie. This was the reality for the Scott family every single week for 4 years straight. Hey everyone, it is really good to have you back. I truly appreciate you taking the time to sit down with me and go through these accounts. Today we are looking at 10 different stories from the early 1980s, a decade that seemed to have a very specific brand of darkness. If you find yourself drawn into these mysteries, please consider subscribing or leaving a comment about where you are tuning in from. It is always interesting to see how far these stories travel. If you are enjoying the pace, go ahead and tap that like button. It helps others find their way to this corner of the internet. It is a bit like leaving a trail of breadcrumbs, though hopefully our trail leads somewhere much better than the ones we are about to follow. Now let us head back to 1980 and look at the life of Dorothy Jane Scott. In the late spring of 1980, in the city of Anaheim, California, a 32-year-old woman named Dorothy Jane Scott was in the middle of a completely ordinary situation. Dorothy was the kind of person who lived for the small, steady joys of a quiet life. She was a single mother who worked as a secretary for a custom rug shop, and she spent almost every spare moment she had with her 4-year-old son, Sean. Dorothy was not someone who looked for trouble. She did not go to bars, she did not stay out late, and she did not have a complicated social circle. She was deeply religious, choosing to spend her Sundays at church and her evenings at home. Those who knew her described her as the rock of the family. If her parents, Vera and Jacob, needed anything, Dorothy was the first person to walk through their door. She had a very predictable rhythm to her days. She would drop her son off, head to the rug shop, handle the filing and the phone calls with a polite professional efficiency, and then head straight back to her roles as a mother and a daughter. She was the kind of person who felt safest in the middle of a routine. She liked knowing exactly what the next hour of her life was going to look like. But starting in early 1980, that sense of security began to erode. It started with the telephone. While she was at work, sitting at her desk, surrounded by samples of thick wool and patterned carpet, the phone would ring. When she answered, a man would be on the other line. At first, he claimed to be in love with her. He told her she was beautiful, and that he was destined to be with her. Dorothy tried to be polite at first, thinking it was a misunderstanding or a wrong number. But the caller knew too much. He would mention things she had done that morning. He would describe the car she was driving. Eventually, the tone shifted from obsessed to violent. He told her he was going to kill her. He told her he was going to wait until she was completely alone, and then he would make her suffer. One of the most unsettling details was that the caller seemed to know her every move. One afternoon, Dorothy had to take her car into the shop for repairs. That same day, the man called her and mentioned that he had seen her at the mechanic. He even described the loaner car she was driving. Dorothy started staying inside. She stopped going out after dark. She was living in a state of constant, quiet hypervigilance. On the evening of May 28, 1980, Dorothy attended an employee meeting at her workplace. It was a normal Wednesday night. Around 9 o'clock, she noticed that one of her coworkers, a man named Conrad Bostron, looked extremely pale. He told her that he had been bitten by a spider on his arm. As the hour passed, the bite began to swell and turn an angry dark purple color. Dorothy, being the person she was, immediately stepped in. She told Conrad that he needed to go to the hospital right away. She offered to drive him along with another coworker named Pam Head. This was Dorothy in her natural element, being the caretaker, putting someone else's crisis ahead of her own fears. The three of them piled into Dorothy's white 1973 Toyota station wagon and headed for the medical center. They arrived at the University of California Irvine Medical Center in Orange. The emergency room was quiet that night. While Conrad was being treated for what turned out to be a black widow spider bite, Dorothy and Pam sat in the waiting room. They talked about mundane things. Dorothy seemed relaxed for the first time in weeks. The sterile, bright lights of the hospital felt like a shield against the darkness outside. Around 11 o'clock that night, the doctors finished treating Conrad. He was given a prescription and told he could go home. Dorothy told Pam and Conrad to stay put in the lobby. She said she would go out to the parking lot alone, bring the car around to the front entrance so Conrad would not have to walk across the pavement, and then they would all head home together. Pam watched Dorothy walk out through the sliding glass doors and disappear into the night. It was a short walk, maybe a couple of 100 feet to where the white station wagon was parked. Minutes passed, then 10 minutes, then 20. Pam and Conrad started to feel a prickle of unease. It should have taken Dorothy less than 60 seconds to reach the car and another minute to drive it to the door. They decided to walk out toward the spot where they knew she had parked. As they stepped onto the asphalt, they saw Dorothy's car, but it was not parked. The engine was revving loudly, and the headlights were blindingly bright. The car was positioned in the middle of the driving lane, pointing toward them. Suddenly, the driver slammed on the gas. The Toyota screeched forward, racing toward Pam and Conrad. They had to jump out of the way to avoid being hit. As the car sped past them, the headlights were so bright that they could not see who was behind the wheel. They assumed Dorothy was in a hurry, or perhaps she had seen something that scared her. They waved their arms and shouted her name, but the car did not slow down. It swerved violently out of the parking lot exit and vanished into the city. For the next few hours, Pam and Conrad waited at the hospital, thinking Dorothy might have had an emergency with her son, or perhaps she was being followed and was trying to lead a pursuer away. But as the sun began to rise on Thursday morning, the reality set in. Dorothy was gone. At about 6 o'clock that morning, a passerby spotted a plume of black smoke in an alleyway about 10 miles away in Santa Ana. When the fire department arrived, they found a white 1973 Toyota station wagon. It had been doused in gasoline and set on fire. The interior was completely gutted. The heat had been so intense that the glass had melted and the metal frame was warped. But there was no sign of Dorothy Jane Scott. No body in the trunk, no footprints in the dirt, just the smell of burnt rubber and gasoline. The investigation hit a wall almost immediately. There were no witnesses in the alleyway, and the hospital parking lot had no cameras in 1980. Dorothy's parents were devastated, but the nightmare was only just beginning for her mother, Vera. 1 week after Dorothy disappeared, the phone in the Scott house rang. Vera picked it up. A voice on the other end said, "Are you related to Dorothy Scott?" Vera said that she was. The man said, "I have her," and then he hung up. This was the start of a psychological torture campaign that is almost unparalleled in criminal history. Every single Wednesday for the next 4 years, the phone would ring. It was always the same man. Sometimes he would ask if Dorothy was home. Other times he would describe how he killed her, or he would tell Vera that she was next. The police tried to trace the calls, but the man never stayed on the line long enough. He seemed to know exactly how the system worked. He also seemed to know Vera's schedule. He would call when she was alone, or right after she had returned from a meeting with investigators. It was clear that the person on the other end of the line was not just a random prankster. He was someone who was still watching them. In June of 1980, a local newspaper published a story about the case. The day it came out, a man called the paper and told the editor that he was the one who killed Dorothy. He provided a detail that had not been released to the public. He said that on the night she was taken, Dorothy was wearing a red scarf. He also mentioned that she had a red carnation in her car. The police confirmed that Dorothy had indeed changed into a red scarf before leaving for the hospital. There had been a carnation on the seat of her car. This meant the caller was the kidnapper. He was reading the news following the grief of the family and using it to fuel his own sense of power. He stayed in the shadows, a ghost with a voice, for 4 long, agonizing years. In August of 1984, a construction crew was working in a remote, brush-covered area of Anaheim. As they were clearing some debris, they found a human skull and several other bones. Beside the remains, they found a turquoise ring and a watch. The watch had stopped at exactly 12:33 on the night Dorothy vanished. Dental records confirmed that the remains belonged to Dorothy Jane Scott. The discovery made national news. The Scott family finally had a place to mourn, but they still had no answers. A few days after the remains were identified, the phone in Vera's kitchen rang one last time. Vera picked it up. The caller did not wait for her to speak. He simply asked, "Do you know Dorothy is home now?" Then there was a click, followed by the steady, hollow drone of a dial tone. The man never called again. Despite the recovery of her bones, there was very little forensic evidence left to process. The area where she was found had been exposed to the elements for 4 years. In 2026, detectives still look at the file. They have tried to pull DNA from the remains, but so far, there has been no match to any known suspect. The identity of the Wednesday caller remains a secret. Today, the Scott case is remembered as a chilling example of how a stalker can dismantle a person's life long before they ever lay a hand on them. Dorothy Jane Scott was a woman who did everything right. She was kind, she was careful, and she was loved. But she was hunted by someone who found a gap in her routine and waited for the one moment she was alone in the dark. The final image of the case is not the hospital or the rug shop. It is the memory of that white station wagon speeding away into the night, its headlights cutting through the darkness of a parking lot, carrying a young mother toward a fate that only one person in the world truly understands. All that is left is the silence of an empty alleyway and the lingering metallic scent of a car that was burned to hide the truth. One small detail remains in the minds of those who studied the case. The caller knew that Dorothy's car was in the shop days before she disappeared. He had been standing somewhere nearby watching her walk from the loaner car to her front door. He was a neighbor, a coworker, or a stranger who had simply decided to make her his project. Whoever he was, he took his reasons with him when the phone finally went silent. In the early summer of 1980, in the quiet village of Tingley, West Yorkshire, a 56-year-old man named Zigmund Adamski was in the middle of a completely ordinary situation. Zigmund was the kind of person who understood the value of a slow, steady routine. That afternoon, he was only walking to the local grocery store to buy some potatoes for dinner. He stepped out of his house on Wakefield Road at precisely 3:30 in the afternoon, wearing his best suit and a heavy overcoat despite the mild June weather. Zigmund was a man who had built his life on the idea of stability. He was a Polish immigrant who had come to England after the Second World War, looking for the kind of peace that only a small, hard-working town could provide. He found that peace in Tingley. For nearly 30 years, he worked as a coal miner at the Lofthouse Colliery, a job that required a specific kind of physical and mental toughness. Zigmund was not a tall man, but he was sturdy, with the kind of thick, calloused hands that come from decades of moving heavy earth deep underground. In the village, he was known as a quiet, deeply dependable neighbor. He was the kind of man who kept his garden perfectly manicured and checked on his neighbors when the winter winds grew too sharp. He lived with his wife Lottie in a small house that smelled like floor wax and home-cooked meals. Lottie suffered from multiple sclerosis, and Zigmund had become her primary caretaker, a role he took on with a patient, unwavering devotion. Every decision he made was centered around her comfort and her needs. Because of Lottie's condition, Zigmund rarely went anywhere for long. He was not a man who wandered or looked for excitement. His life was a narrow, comfortable path between the mine, the grocery store, and his living room chair. He was so punctual that people in Tingley joked you could set your watch by the moment he stepped out to get the morning paper. He liked things that made sense. He liked a world where, if you put in a hard day of work, you earned a quiet evening at home. That Saturday was supposed to be a celebration. It was the day before his goddaughter's wedding, and the house was filled with the quiet anticipation of the upcoming ceremony. Zigmund had been in good spirits all morning, helping Lottie with her chores and making sure his suit was pressed and ready. The trip to the shops was just one last errand before they settled in for the night. He told Lottie he would be back in less than half an hour, just enough time to walk down the road, grab the potatoes, and return. As he walked down Wakefield Road, he was seen by a neighbor who later recalled that Zigmund seemed perfectly normal. He wasn't in a hurry, he wasn't looking over his shoulder, and he didn't look like a man who was planning to disappear. He was just a 56-year-old miner on a weekend errand, enjoying the afternoon air. He passed the familiar brick houses and the small gardens of his friends, walking toward the intersection that would take him to the local shops. He never made it to the store. When 4 o'clock came and went, Lottie didn't panic, but she felt a small, nagging sense of confusion. Zigmund was never late. By 5 o'clock, that confusion had turned into a cold, sharp fear. She knew her husband better than anyone, and she knew he would never leave her alone for that long without a word. She contacted their friends and family, and soon the small village of Tingley was buzzing with the news that Zigmund Adamski, the most reliable man in town, was missing. The police were called, but they were initially dismissive. They assumed that perhaps the stress of the upcoming wedding or the burden of caretaking had finally gotten to him. They suggested he might have gone for a long walk, or perhaps stopped at a pub for a pint. But Lottie was adamant. She told them that Zigmund didn't drink, he didn't have any enemies, and he certainly didn't have any reason to walk away from his life. He had left his wallet and his identification at home. For 5 days the search continued. The West Yorkshire police combed the surrounding fields and interviewed dozens of people, but they found absolutely nothing. There was no evidence of a struggle, no sightings of him getting into a car, and no record of him taking a train or a bus. It was as if he had simply stepped off the face of the earth while walking down a well-lit, familiar street in broad daylight. The community was left in a state of stunned, quiet disbelief. On the afternoon of June 11, 1980, the mystery took a turn that would baffle investigators for decades. A man named Trevor Parker was working at a coal yard in the town of Batley, about 5 miles away from where Zigmund had vanished. The yard was a gritty industrial place, filled with massive mounds of anthracite coal that were used to fuel the local trains. Trevor was used to the black dust and the heavy machinery, but that afternoon he saw something that stopped him cold. At the very summit of a 12-foot-high pile of coal, Trevor saw the shape of a man. The pile was steep, almost vertical in some places, and the coal was loose and slippery. It was the kind of terrain that was nearly impossible for a human to climb without leaving massive, obvious tracks and disturbing the fine layer of black dust that covered everything. But as Trevor looked up, he saw a body lying flat on its back, staring up at the gray Yorkshire sky. Trevor scrambled up the pile as best he could, and when he reached the top, he found the body of Zigmund Adamski. He was wearing the same suit he had left the house in 5 days earlier, but something was immediately and clearly wrong. Zigmund was wearing his heavy overcoat, but he had no shirt on underneath it. His trousers were unzipped and buckled improperly, as if someone who didn't understand how human clothes worked had tried to dress him in a hurry. Even more disturbing was the condition of the coal pile itself. Despite the fact that Zigmund's body was lying directly on top of the anthracite, there was not a single footprint in the dust surrounding him. There were no marks in the loose coal to suggest that he had climbed up the pile, and there were no signs that anyone else had carried him there. It was as if he had been lowered onto the peak of the mountain of coal from directly above, placed there with a precision that defied physics. When the police and the coroner James Turnbull arrived at the scene, they found even more inconsistencies. Zigmund had only 1 day of beard growth on his face, despite having been missing for 5 full days. This suggested that he had been somewhere, likely indoors, and cared for the first 4 days of his disappearance. But his clothes were relatively clean, and his body showed no signs of the typical dehydration or exposure you would expect from someone who had been living on the streets. During the autopsy, the medical examiners found something that moved the case from strange to terrifying. On the back of Zigmund's neck and on his shoulders, there were several small horseshoe-shaped burns. These wounds were not consistent with any known tool or industrial accident. Even more bizarrely, the burns were smeared with a thick, translucent green ointment. It was a gel-like substance that smelled slightly of chemicals, but did not match any ointment found in a pharmacy or a hospital. Forensic labs across the United Kingdom analyzed the green gel, but they were unable to identify its composition. It wasn't petroleum-based, it wasn't water-based, and it contained no known biological markers. It was as if the substance had been created for a medical purpose that didn't exist in human science. The burns themselves appeared to have been treated with this gel recently, yet the skin beneath the ointment was showing signs of a very strange, rapid cellular breakdown. The coroner James Turnbull had seen thousands of deaths in his career, but he would later state that the Adamski case was the most puzzling he had ever encountered. The cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but the circumstances surrounding that heart attack were impossible to explain. Zigmund had no history of heart trouble. It was as if his body had been subjected to a level of extreme sudden terror that his heart simply could not survive, followed by a surgical disposal. One of the first officers on the scene was a man named Alan Godfrey. He was a young, pragmatic policeman who didn't believe in ghost stories. But as he stood on top of that coal pile looking at the pristine black dust and the strangely dressed man, he felt a sense of profound unease that he couldn't shake. He noted that Zigmund's watch was missing, and his wallet, which he had left at home, was still sitting on his dresser in Tingley. Zigmund had died 5 miles from home, in a suit on a coal pile. Months after the discovery of Zigmund's body, PC Alan Godfrey was on patrol in the same area when he claimed to have a close encounter with a massive diamond-shaped craft hovering over the road. While many people dismissed his story as a hallucination brought on by the stress of the Adamski case, it added a layer of high strangeness to the investigation that has never been resolved. The community began to whisper about things that didn't belong in the Yorkshire sky. The investigation eventually went cold. The police were never able to find a single witness who saw Zigmund between the time he left his house and the moment he was found on the coal pile. They couldn't explain how he got to Batley, why he was missing his shirt, or how he ended up on top of a 12-foot mound of coal without leaving a single mark in the dust. Every logical avenue led to a dead end, leaving the family with a heart attack that felt like a cover story. For Lottie, the end of the search brought no closure. She was left in a house that felt too large and too quiet, mourning a man who had gone out for potatoes and returned as a national mystery. She never believed the heart attack theory, and she never believed that Zigmund had left her willingly. She lived the rest of her life knowing that her husband had encountered something in the middle of a Saturday afternoon that was so foreign and so frightening it stopped his heart. Zigmund Adamski was buried in a quiet ceremony, a hard-working miner who had become a footnote in the history of the unexplained. The case remains open in the sense that it is unsolved, but there are no more leads to follow and no more witnesses to interview. The green ointment and the horseshoe burns remain in the files of the West Yorkshire Police, a physical record of an event that defies every rule of criminology and every law of the physical world. The final image of the case is Trevor Parker looking up at the summit of that coal pile. He remembers the way the sun hit the suit jacket and the way the body looked so peaceful in such a violent industrial place. He remembers the silence of the yard and the strange lingering smell of the green gel in the air. It is a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary lives are interrupted by things that have no place in our reality. The cold truth of the matter is that a man who spent his life working in the darkness of the earth ended up being found on a mountain of the very coal he used to mine, staring at the stars. There is no explanation for the missing shirt, the lack of footprints, or the 24 hours of beard growth. There is only the memory of a man walking down a familiar street and the smear of an unidentified green ointment on a neck that had seen things no one was ever meant to see. In the heat of July 1981, in the small town of Skidmore, Missouri, a community of 400 people was in the middle of a completely ordinary situation. Ken Rex McElroy, 47 years old, was the kind of person who defined the word predator. That morning he was only sitting in his silver Chevrolet Silverado, parked right in the center of town, sipping a soda as the humidity began to rise. To understand why 46 people were about to stand in a circle and watch a man die, you have to understand the 20 years that led up to that morning. Ken McElroy was not just a criminal. He was a man who had turned the legal system of Northwest Missouri into his own personal playground. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and intimidating, with thick sideburns and a gaze that made people look at their shoes. Ken lived on a farm outside of town, but he spent his days patrolling the streets of Skidmore like he owned them. He was a cattle rustler and a grain thief on a massive scale. Everyone knew where the missing livestock went, and everyone knew who was emptying the silos at night. But knowing something in a small town is very different from proving it in a court of law when the main suspect knows where you live. For 2 decades, Ken McElroy had been charged with dozens of felonies. We are talking about arson, assault, child molestation, and attempted murder. Every single time the process followed the same pattern. Ken would be arrested, he would post bail immediately, and then the witnesses would start having accidents. A barn would burn down in the middle of the night. A front porch would be riddled with shotgun shells. By the time the trial date arrived, the witnesses would either move away or suddenly lose their memory on the stand. Ken would sit in the front row of the courtroom, leaning back with a smirk on his face, staring directly at the person testifying. He didn't have to say a word. The threat was written in the way he adjusted his cap or the way he followed them to their car after the hearing was over. The people of Skidmore were hard-working farmers and shopkeepers who believed in the law. They believed that if you did the right thing and told the truth, the system would protect you. But year after year, they watched the system fail. They watched Ken walk out of the courthouse a free man over and over again. It created a sense of profound, heavy hopelessness that settled over the town like a thick fog. Ken's personal life was just as dark as his criminal record. He had been married several times and was known for grooming young girls. He had taken his current wife, Trina, when she was only 12 years old. He had burned down her family's home and shot their dog to ensure they wouldn't try to take her back. He was a man who used violence as a language, and by 1981, the town was exhausted from listening to it. The final string of events began over something as small as a piece of candy. One afternoon, one of Ken's children was in the local grocery store, owned by an elderly, well-liked man named Bo Bowenkamp. There was a minor dispute over whether the child had paid for a piece of gum. It was the kind of small-town interaction that should have been forgotten in 5 minutes, but for Ken McElroy, it was an excuse for a war. Ken began a campaign of harassment against the Bowenkamp family. He would park his truck outside their store for hours, just staring through the front window. He would follow Bo's wife Margaret as she walked to her car. He wanted them to know that he was there, and he wanted them to know that he was patient. The tension in the store became so thick that customers stopped coming in, afraid they would be caught in the crossfire. In July 1980, the harassment turned into physical violence. Ken confronted the 70-year-old Bo Bowenkamp outside the store and shot him in the neck with a shotgun. It was a miracle that Bo survived. For the first time, the town thought they finally had him. There were witnesses, there was a victim, and there was a clear motive. Ken was arrested, and for once he was actually convicted of assault. But the relief in Skidmore lasted less than 24 hours. Despite the conviction, Ken was released on a small bond while his lawyers prepared an appeal. The very next day, he drove his silver Silverado back into the center of Skidmore. He had an M1 Garand rifle mounted in the rear window and a hand-rolled cigarette hanging from his lip. He went straight to the D&G Tavern and ordered a drink like nothing had happened. This was the first small deviation from the town's breaking point. Usually after a conviction, a criminal would lay low, but Ken was emboldened. He started making comments about how he was going to finish what he started with Bo Bowenkamp. He was seen outside the grocery store again, pointing his finger like a gun at anyone who looked his way. The town realized that the law was never going to stop him. The pressure began to rise to an unbearable level on the morning of July 10, 1981. The local sheriff, knowing the town was at a boiling point, had called a meeting at the Legion Hall. He wanted to discuss how the residents could form a neighborhood watch to protect themselves legally. About 80 men from the town and the surrounding farms showed up, their faces etched with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. While the meeting was happening, word reached the hall that Ken McElroy had just pulled up outside the D&G Tavern. He was sitting in his truck with his wife Trina, acting as if the entire town didn't exist. The men in the meeting looked at each other. They didn't need to speak. The sheriff told them to stay calm and let the law handle it, but the sheriff himself then got into his car and drove out of town. The meeting at the Legion Hall didn't break up. Instead, it transformed. The men walked out of the building in a single silent mass. As they moved down the main street toward the tavern, other people joined them. Women stepped off their porches. Shopkeepers locked their doors and fell into step. By the time they reached the silver Silverado, there were 46 people surrounding the vehicle in a tight human circle. Ken McElroy was sitting in the driver's seat. He saw the crowd through his mirrors, but he didn't move. He didn't try to start the engine. He reached for a cigarette and lit it, his movements slow and deliberate. He was so used to people flinching when he looked at them that he likely believed this was just another group he could intimidate. He sat there puffing smoke, staring straight ahead through the dusty windshield. Trina sat in the passenger seat looking at the faces of their neighbors. These were people they saw every day at the post office and the feed store. But today their eyes were different. There was no fear in them. There was only a cold, hard finality. The silence in the street was absolute. Not a single person in the crowd spoke. There were no shouts, no insults, and no warnings. There was only the sound of the wind. The point of no return arrived in a split second. From two different positions in the crowd, the silence was shattered by the crack of rifle fire. Several bullets punched through the rear window of the truck and the driver's side glass. Ken McElroy was hit multiple times in the head and neck. He slumped over the steering wheel, his cigarette falling into his lap. He was dead before he could even reach for the rifle in the back. Trina screamed and scrambled out of the truck, clutching her husband's arm. She looked at the 46 people standing around the vehicle. She saw the smoke drifting from the crowd. She began to yell for help, calling out the names of the men she recognized. She pointed at them, accusing them of being the shooters. But the people didn't react. They didn't run. They didn't even look at her. One by one, the 46 witnesses turned around and walked away. They didn't go back to the Legion Hall. They didn't go to the police station. They simply went back to their lives. Within 3 minutes, the street was completely empty. The only thing left was the silver Silverado, the engine off, and the body of the man who had terrorized the town for 20 years cooling in the front seat. When the investigators arrived from the Highway Patrol and later the FBI, they were met with a wall of silence that was unlike anything they had ever experienced. They interviewed every single person who had been in the street that day. They asked the same questions over and over again. Who fired the shots? Where were you standing? What did you see? Every person gave the exact same answer. I didn't see a thing. The investigation lasted for months. The grand jury was called. Trina McElroy testified and named specific people she claimed she saw holding guns. She was the only one who spoke. The other 45 witnesses maintained their story with a discipline that was terrifying to the authorities. They claimed they had heard shots, but when they looked up, the street was already empty. They claimed the sun was in their eyes. The redefining clue in the case was not a piece of ballistics or a fingerprint. It was the collective memory of the town. The investigators realized that the people of Skidmore had made a conscious decision to delete the event from their history. They were not protecting a single killer. They were protecting themselves and the peace they had finally earned. The silence was not a lack of evidence. It was the evidence itself. The pressure on the town was immense. The media descended on Skidmore, portraying it as a lawless place of vigilante justice. But the residents didn't care. They stopped talking to reporters. They stopped talking to the FBI. They had spent 20 years living in a nightmare, and they were not going to let the legal system that had failed them for so long take away the quiet they had finally found. The final tightening before the case went cold happened when the grand jury refused to issue any indictments. Despite the presence of dozens of witnesses and a clear motive, there was no one to charge. You cannot prosecute a shadow. The legal system had to admit defeat. The town had used the very same tactics of intimidation and silence that Ken McElroy had used against them, and it had worked perfectly. The climax of the story is the realization that justice in a small town is sometimes a very different thing than justice in a textbook. Ken McElroy was killed in broad daylight in front of nearly 50 people, and in the eyes of the law, he was killed by no one. The community had performed a surgical removal of a cancer that the state had refused to treat, and then they had simply closed the wound. Today, Skidmore is a much quieter place. Most of the people who stood in that circle in 1981 have passed away, taking the names of the shooters to their graves. The case remains officially unsolved, a permanent mark on the record of Missouri law enforcement. But if you talk to the older residents, they don't talk about a murder. They talk about the day the clouds finally moved out and the sun came back. The cold ending of the story is found in the physical remnants of that July morning. For a long time after the shooting, the silver Silverado sat in a local impound lot, its glass shattered and the interior stained with the history of the town. But eventually, even the truck was gone. All that is left is the silence of 46 people walking away from a dusty street, leaving a dead man behind and never looking back. On November 28, 1981, at a British military base in Paderborn, West Germany, a 2-year-old girl named Katrice Lee was in the middle of a completely ordinary situation. Katrice was the kind of child who was a bright, energetic presence in every room she entered. She had curly brown hair, a mischievous smile, and a specific way of tilting her head when she was curious about something. That morning, she was only celebrating her 2nd birthday with a trip to the local supermarket. To understand the world Katrice lived in, you have to understand the unique environment of the British forces in West Germany during the Cold War. Thousands of British soldiers and their families lived in gated communities that were essentially small pieces of England dropped into the German countryside. These bases were high-security environments surrounded by fences and guarded by military police. For the families living inside the base was the safest place on earth. Katrice's father, Richard Lee, was a sergeant in the British Army. He was a disciplined man who took great pride in his service and his family. He and his wife Sharon had created a warm, stable home for Katrice and her older sister Wendy. In their military quarters, the upcoming birthday was the only thing anyone was talking about. Sharon had spent days planning a party, buying decorations, and making sure everything was perfect for her youngest daughter's big day. The morning of the 28th began with the kind of excitement that only a 2-year-old can generate. Katrice was thrilled to be the center of attention. Before they left the house, Sharon dressed her in a brand new outfit for the occasion. She put her in a bright red duffel coat with a hood and small toggle buttons. It was a sturdy, warm coat designed to handle the biting chill of a German November. Katrice loved the coat and she beamed as she looked at herself in the hallway mirror. The plan for the morning was simple. Sharon, Katrice, and Sharon's sister Wendy were going to take the short drive to the NAAFI supermarket. NAAFI stands for the Navy, Army, and Air Force Institutes, and these stores were the hub of military social life. They sold everything from British tea and biscuits to toys and household goods. For the families in Paderborn, the NAAFI was a slice of home where you could hear English voices and buy familiar brands. The supermarket was located within the Schloss Neuhaus area, a secure part of the installation. As they pulled into the parking lot, the air was crisp and smelled of wood smoke and damp pavement. The store was busy that morning, filled with other military families doing their weekend shopping. Soldiers in uniform stood in line next to mothers pushing strollers. There was a sense of total, unquestioned security. Nobody watched their children with fear because everyone around them was part of the same military family. Inside the store, the atmosphere was bright and fluorescent. The aisles were packed with shelves of goods, and the sound of shopping carts clicking over the linoleum floor filled the air. Katrice was being her usual self, chatting away and staying close to her mother's side. They moved through the aisles, picking up the last few items for the birthday party later that afternoon. They had the cake, the juice, and the small prizes for the games they planned to play. Sharon was focused on her list, checking off items as they went. They reached the checkout area, which was crowded with people waiting to pay. The line was long and the air near the front of the store was warm from the heaters near the automatic doors. Katrice was standing between her mother and her Aunt Wendy, looking at the candy displays near the registers. She seemed perfectly content, her small hand resting against the fabric of her mother's coat. This was the first small deviation in the morning's routine. As Sharon reached the front of the line, she looked down at her cart and realized she had forgotten a specific box of potato chips that Katrice particularly liked. It was a small detail, but because it was Katrice's birthday, Sharon wanted everything to be exactly right. She looked at Wendy and then at Katrice. The aisle where the chips were located was only a few yards away, just around the corner from the checkout bank. Sharon told Wendy to keep an eye on Katrice for just a second while she ran back to grab the chips. She didn't want to bring the whole group back through the crowded aisles and lose their spot in line. Wendy nodded and Sharon turned away. The walk to the snack aisle took less than 30 seconds. She found the box, turned back around, and walked straight back to the register. The entire trip had taken less than a minute. She had been gone for perhaps 45 to 60 seconds at most. When Sharon returned to the line, she saw Wendy standing by the cart, but Katrice was not there. Sharon asked where she was, and Wendy looked confused. Wendy said that she thought Katrice had run after Sharon when she went to get the chips. She assumed the toddler had followed her mother's heels around the corner. Sharon's heart skipped a beat. She looked down the aisle she had just walked, expecting to see a small girl in a bright red coat wandering toward her. But the aisle was empty. The supermarket was relatively small, and a child in a bright red coat should have been easy to spot against the neutral colors of the store. Sharon and Wendy began to move through the aisles, calling Katrice's name. At first their voices were calm, tinged only with the slight annoyance of a parent whose child has wandered off. But as they completed a full circuit of the store and found no sign of the red coat, that annoyance transformed into a cold, paralyzing dread. The supermarket staff was notified, and they immediately stopped people from leaving the store. The military police, the Royal Military Police, or RMP, were called to the scene. Because this was a secure military base, the assumption was that Katrice had simply wandered out of the front doors and was perhaps playing in the parking lot or had wandered toward the nearby housing units. The RMP told Sharon to stay calm, suggesting that a child couldn't simply disappear from a gated installation. However, the initial response was plagued by a series of catastrophic assumptions. The military police treated the incident as a missing person case rather than a potential abduction. They didn't immediately lock down the gates of the base. They didn't search every vehicle leaving the Schloss Neuhaus area. They didn't even interview the checkout staff or the people in line behind Sharon until hours had passed. They were operating on the logic of a base where everyone is a comrade, not the logic of a crime scene. As the hours turned into evening, a massive search operation was launched. Hundreds of soldiers were diverted from their duties to form human chains, sweeping through the woods, the fields, and the residential areas surrounding the NAAFI. They searched every basement, every attic, and every storage shed. Divers were sent into the Alme River, which ran near the base, fearing that Katrice might have wandered toward the water and fallen in. They found nothing. No red coat, no shoes, no trace at all. The rising pressure on the Lee family was unimaginable. Richard Lee was brought back from his post, and he immediately began pushing the investigators to do more. He was a sergeant, he knew how to lead, and he was horrified by the lack of urgency he saw in the RMP's handling of the case. He pointed out that Katrice was only 2 years old. She couldn't have walked out of the base gates on her own. She couldn't have navigated the complex layout of the installation without being seen. The theory that began to emerge, and the one that Richard Lee holds to this day, is that Katrice was snatched by someone who had authorized access to the base. It was a Saturday morning, and the base was full of people who belonged there. Someone could have seen the small child standing alone for those 60 seconds, picked her up, and walked out to a car. If they had a military sticker on their windshield, they would have been waved through the gates without a second thought. The investigation eventually stalled. The RMP focused heavily on the theory that Katrice had drowned in the river, despite the fact that divers had searched the water repeatedly and found nothing. They ignored reports of a green car seen idling near the supermarket entrance. They failed to coordinate with the German civil police in a timely manner, meaning that by the time the border crossings were being watched, a kidnapper could have been hundreds of miles away in any direction. One of the most heartbreaking details of the case was a redefining clue that emerged years later. Katrice had a rare medical condition, a turned eye, that required specialized surgery. It was a condition that would have been obvious to anyone who looked at her closely. Richard Lee argued that if she had been abducted and raised by another family, they would have had to seek medical treatment for her eye at some point. But the medical records across Europe were never systematically checked for a child matching her description. For 40 years, Richard Lee has refused to let the case go. He has spent his own money, conducted his own interviews, and publicly criticized the British Ministry of Defense for their failures in 1981. He has lived with the agonizing knowledge that his daughter vanished on her birthday while wearing a coat he had just seen her admire in the mirror. He still keeps a box of birthday presents in his car, just in case he ever gets the call that she has been found. In 2018, nearly 4 decades after she disappeared, the case was reopened under a new operation called Operation Butte. Forensic teams returned to Paderborn and conducted a massive dig on the banks of the Alme River using modern technology that didn't exist in the 80s. They spent weeks sifting through the dirt, looking for any fragment of bone or fabric. The world watched, hoping for a resolution to one of the most enduring mysteries in British military history. The dig yielded nothing. They found old military equipment, rusted cans and trash from the Cold War era, but no sign of Katrice Lee. The point of no return had long since passed. The people who were in the NAAFI that day had aged memories, had faded, and the physical environment of the base had changed. The frustration for the Lee family was compounded by the revelation that the RMP had actually lost several key files and witness statements from the original investigation. The climax of the story is the realization that the very thing that was supposed to keep Katrice safe, the high-security environment of the military base, was exactly what allowed her to vanish. The predator didn't have to break in. They were already inside the wire. They were someone the community trusted. Someone who knew the rhythms of the base and knew exactly how to exploit a 60-second window of opportunity on a busy Saturday morning. Today, Katrice Lee would be in her mid-40s. Somewhere in the world, there may be a woman who has no memory of a bright red duffel coat or a birthday party in West Germany. She might look in the mirror and wonder why her eye is turned, or why she feels a strange sense of unease when she walks through a supermarket. The case remains open, a permanent scar on the history of the British Army, and a testament to the enduring grief of a father who will never stop searching. The cold ending of the story is not found in a laboratory or a courtroom. It is found in the quiet, sterile aisles of a Nafi supermarket that no longer exists in the same form. It is the image of a mother turning a corner with a box of potato chips in her hand, her eyes scanning the checkout line for a flash of red fabric that isn't there. All that remains is the silent space on the linoleum where a 2-year-old girl stood for 1 minute before disappearing into history. In June 1981, in a quiet residential district of Paris, France, a 25-year-old student named Renee Hartevelt was in the middle of a completely ordinary situation. Renee was the kind of person who was intellectually curious and deeply kind. That afternoon, she was only visiting a classmate's apartment to discuss German poetry for an upcoming literature seminar. She walked along the Rue Erard with a stack of books under her arm, enjoying the warm light of a Parisian summer evening. Renee was a Dutch exchange student studying at the prestigious Sorbonne. She was described by everyone who knew her as vibrant, intelligent, and remarkably beautiful. She had long blonde hair and a grace that seemed to draw people toward her. In the competitive, often cold world of Parisian academia, Renee was the exception. She was the person who stayed behind to help a struggling student with their translations or shared her detailed notes without being asked. She had a future that seemed written in the stars. She spoke multiple languages fluently and had a deep, soulful appreciation for music and art. Her apartment was filled with the sounds of classical records and the smell of fresh coffee. For Renee, Paris was not just a city, it was a classroom. She spent her weekends in the Louvre and her evenings in the small cafes of the Latin Quarter, soaking up the history and the culture she had spent years studying. To Renee, the world was a place of logic and beauty. She believed in the power of conversation and the shared pursuit of knowledge. That was why she had befriended a fellow student named Issei Sagawa. Issei was a 32-year-old PhD student from Japan who was also studying at the Sorbonne. He was a small, frail man who often appeared lonely and socially awkward. In a city as large and intimidating as Paris, Renee felt a sense of pity for him. Issei was the son of a very wealthy and influential Japanese businessman. He lived in a quiet, modern apartment on the Rue Erard, funded entirely by his family's fortune. To the other students, Issei was just an eccentric foreigner. He was polite, soft-spoken, and deeply invested in his studies of European literature. He had a specific obsession with German poetry, particularly the work of Johannes Becker, which was the topic of the seminar he and Renee were taking. For months, Issei had been carefully cultivating a friendship with Renee. He would invite her to dinner or ask for her help with his French pronunciation. To Renee, these invitations seemed harmless, if a bit persistent. She saw him as a struggling peer, someone who was trying to navigate a foreign culture just as she was. She had no way of knowing that Issei had been harboring a dark, obsessive urge since he was a small child in Japan. Issei's obsession was not born of love or even traditional attraction. It was a pathological desire to consume. He believed that by eating the flesh of a woman he considered beautiful, he could absorb her vitality and her grace into his own frail body. He had spent years writing about these urges in his private diaries. Treating the idea of cannibalism as a purely intellectual and aesthetic pursuit, in his mind it was the ultimate expression of admiration. By June of 1981, Issei had decided that Renee was the perfect subject for his desires. He began planning the afternoon with a surgical level of detail. He bought a small caliber rifle from a local shop and spent days practicing how to handle it quietly. He cleared his apartment of any clutter and prepared his cooking utensils. He even bought a typewriter and placed it on his desk, ensuring it was loaded with paper and ready to be used. When Renee arrived at his apartment on the afternoon of June 11th, the atmosphere was quiet and scholarly. Issei had prepared a simple dinner, and they sat at his small table surrounded by books and papers. They talked about their coursework and the complexities of German Romanticism. To any observer, it was a perfectly normal academic meeting. Renee felt safe in the apartment because Issei seemed too weak and too polite to ever be a threat to anyone. This was the first small deviation in the evening. As they transitioned from dinner to their study session, Issei asked Renee if she would mind reading some poetry aloud so he could record her voice for his pronunciation practice. Renee agreed and sat down at the desk. As she began to read, Issei turned on his typewriter. He began to type rapidly and loudly, the rhythmic clicking filling the small room. Renee found it a bit distracting, but she continued to read the poem. Issei had turned on the typewriter for a very specific reason. He wanted the mechanical noise to drown out the sound of the rifle. While Renee was focused on the text in front of her, Issei stepped behind her chair. He moved with a sudden cold precision that contradicted his frail appearance. He lifted the rifle, aimed it at the back of Renee's neck, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot was muffled by the frantic clicking of the typewriter keys. Renee Hartevelt died instantly. She never knew what happened, and she never had the chance to scream. Issei immediately turned off the typewriter and the recording device. The apartment returned to a state of absolute heavy silence. For the next 2 days, Issei Sagawa remained in the apartment with Renee's remains. He treated the situation not with panic, but with a strange methodical calm that is almost impossible for a normal person to comprehend. During those 48 hours, Issei followed through on his long-held desires. He documented the entire process in his diary, describing his actions in the same detached academic tone he used for his literary critiques. He viewed the act of cannibalism as a ritual. He consumed parts of her body, later stating that the flavor was like high-quality tuna. Between these acts, he would sit at his desk and continue to work on his PhD thesis as if nothing had changed. The point of no return came on the 3rd day. Issei realized that he could not keep the remains in his apartment forever. He began the process of disposing of what was left. He placed the remains into 2 large, heavy suitcases. He then called a taxi and asked the driver to take him to the Bois de Boulogne, a large and famous park on the edge of Paris. He planned to dump the suitcases in a remote area of the woods and then return to his life at the Sorbonne. However, Issei was not a professional criminal. He was an academic who had become untethered from reality. As he struggled to drag the heavy suitcases through the park toward a nearby lake, he caught the attention of a couple who were walking their dog. They noticed that the suitcases were leaking a dark, thick liquid that looked like blood. When Issei saw them watching him, he panicked. He abandoned the suitcases in a thicket of bushes and ran toward the park exit. The couple immediately notified the police. When the investigators opened the suitcases, they found a crime scene that was so horrific it left seasoned French detectives in a state of shock. They found Issei's student identification card in one of the pockets of the luggage. Within hours, the police were at the door of his apartment on the Rue Erard. They found the rifle, the typewriter, and the remains of the meal Issei had prepared for Renee. Issei Sagawa was arrested without a struggle. He confessed to everything, immediately speaking to the investigators with a terrifying level of honesty. He didn't show remorse. Instead, he seemed almost proud of what he had done, explaining his philosophy of cannibalism in great detail. The French public was horrified. The case became an international sensation, and Issei was labeled the Japanese cannibal by the global media. The rising pressure of the case moved into the legal system. Because Issei's confession was so detailed and his behavior was so bizarre, he was sent to a psychiatric hospital for evaluation. A panel of 3 French doctors examined him for months. They eventually concluded that Issei was legally insane at the time of the crime. They stated that he suffered from a deep-seated psychosis that made him unable to understand the nature of his actions. Under French law, a person who is declared legally insane cannot be tried for a crime. Instead, they must be committed to a mental institution. Issei's wealthy father used his influence to advocate for his son to be returned to Japan to receive treatment in a familiar environment. In 1984, the French authorities agreed to deport Issei Sagawa back to his home country, with the understanding that he would be permanently institutionalized there. But this is where the story takes a turn into a legal failure of global proportions. When Issei arrived in Japan, he was checked into a psychiatric ward. However, the French authorities had officially dropped the charges against him because he was unfit for trial. This meant that legally there were no active criminal charges against Issei Sagawa in the eyes of the Japanese government. They had no legal grounds to keep him confined against his will. The Japanese doctors who examined him reached a different conclusion than the French panel. They argued that Issei was not insane, but rather possessed a severe personality disorder. In their view, he was sane enough to understand his crimes. Because of this disagreement between the 2 nations, a massive legal loophole opened. Since he was sane by Japanese standards, he couldn't be kept in a mental hospital, but since the French charges were gone, he couldn't be jailed. In August of 1985, only 15 months after he arrived in Japan, Issei Sagawa walked out of the hospital a free man. He had killed and consumed a woman in Paris, and he was now back in society without ever serving a single day in prison. The injustice of the situation sparked outrage in France and the Netherlands, but the legal reality was final. Issei was free to live his life in Tokyo as he saw fit. What happened next is perhaps the most disturbing part of the entire case. Instead of living a life of quiet shame, Issei Sagawa became a minor celebrity in Japan. He wrote several best-selling books about the murder, providing graphic details that the public consumed with a morbid curiosity. He was invited onto talk shows, he wrote restaurant reviews for magazines, and he even appeared in a commercial for a meat company. He profited immensely from his crime. He spent the rest of his life as a public figure, often seen walking the streets of Tokyo or speaking at events about his desires. He never expressed regret for what he did to Renee Hartevelt. In his mind, he had achieved his goal. She was a part of him forever. He lived as a free man for nearly 40 years, eventually passing away from natural causes in 2022. He died in a hospital, surrounded by the comforts his wealth and fame had provided. The aftermath for the Hartevelt family was a life sentence of grief and unanswered questions. They had to watch from a distance as the man who murdered their daughter became a media star. The case remains a symbol of how international legal systems can fail so completely that a monster is allowed to hide in plain sight. It highlighted the vast differences in how nations define insanity and how those definitions can be exploited by the wealthy and the connected. Renee Hartevelt is remembered today, not for the way she died, but for the person she was before she entered that apartment on the Rue Erard. She is remembered as a brilliant student who believed in the goodness of people and the beauty of art. Her life was a testament to human potential, while Issei's life was a testament to human depravity. The tragedy of the case is that her kindness was the very thing the predator used to lure her into his reach. The final image of the case is the quiet interior of that Parisian apartment. It is the sight of a stack of German poetry books sitting on a desk next to a heavy black typewriter. It is the realization that a young woman's voice was silenced by the very sounds of the academic world she loved so much. All that remains is the cold memory of a deal made between two countries that left a family with nothing and a killer with a career. The redefining clue in the story was the typewriter itself. It was not just an office tool. It was a weapon of psychological camouflage. Issei Sagawa knew that the people in the neighboring apartments would hear the rhythmic clicking and assume a student was hard at work on their thesis. They would hear the sound of progress and intellectual labor, never suspecting that the noise was actually the soundtrack to a triple tragedy of murder, cannibalism, and a total collapse of justice. Issei Sagawa took his secrets and his lack of remorse to his grave in 2022. But the story of Renee Hartevelt continues to serve as a warning. It is a reminder that predators do not always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the lonely person in the back of the classroom who just needs a little bit of help with their translations. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the room is the person who seems to have no power at all. The final chilling detail is the sound that echoes through the story. It is the sound of the mechanical keys striking the paper, one after another, masking the reality of what was happening just a few feet away. It is a sound that represents the cold, detached nature of a man who viewed human life as a commodity. Today, that apartment on the Rue Erard has new tenants, and the street is as quiet as it was in 1981. But the air still holds the echo of a typewriter clicking into the night. In the middle of August 1980, in the deep red heart of the Australian outback, a family of 5 was in the middle of a completely ordinary situation. Lindy Chamberlain, a 32-year-old mother, was the kind of person who found comfort in order and took great pride in her role as a protector. That evening, she was only finishing up a simple outdoor dinner at a campsite near the base of the massive red monolith known as Uluru. Lindy was a woman built on a foundation of faith and practicality. She was married to Michael Chamberlain, a pastor in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and together they had built a life centered around their community and their 3 children. They lived in Mount Isa, a mining town in Queensland where life was rugged and the community was tight. Lindy was not a woman of many words, but she was a woman of action. She was the one who kept the family schedule running, who made sure the boys Aiden and Reagan were washed and fed, and who approached every challenge with a steady, unsentimental gaze. Her life was defined by the rhythms of the church and the demands of raising a young family. Michael was often busy with his ministry, leaving Lindy to manage the household. She was known for being exceptionally organized, a trait that some people mistook for coldness, but for Lindy it was simply the way she survived the chaos of motherhood. In 1980, the family was celebrating a new addition, a 9-week-old baby girl named Azaria. Azaria was the daughter Lindy had always wanted, a tiny, bright-eyed baby who seemed to complete their family circle perfectly. The trip to Uluru was meant to be a rare break from the heat and the routine of Mount Isa. It was a long, dusty drive across the Northern Territory, thousands of miles of flat saltbush plains and red dirt roads. They drove their yellow Torana hatchback, a car that was packed to the roof with camping gear, diapers, and food, to Lindy. This trip was a chance to show her children the majesty of the Australian wilderness, a landscape that was as beautiful as it was unforgiving. She had prepared for every eventuality, packing enough supplies to survive a week in the desert if they had to. By the time they reached the Ayers Rock campground, the family was settled into a comfortable vacation rhythm. They spent their days exploring the base of the rock and watching the colors shift from orange to deep purple as the sun went down. Lindy was in her element, managing the campsite with her usual efficiency. She was careful with the children, keeping a close eye on them in the harsh environment. She was the kind of mother who knew exactly where her kids were at every moment, a habit born from years of living in remote areas where the wild was always just a few feet away. On the night of August 17th, the temperature in the desert began to drop rapidly as the sun disappeared behind the horizon. The Chamberlains were gathered around a communal barbecue area with several other campers. The air smelled of wood smoke and sizzling meat. Lindy had just finished feeding Azaria and had walked over to their tent, which was pitched only a few yards away from the cooking area. She tucked the infant into a bassinet inside the tent, making sure she was warm and secure before stepping back out to join Michael and the boys for their own meal. This was the first small deviation in an otherwise perfect evening. As they sat by the fire, Michael noticed a dingo lingering at the edge of the light. It was a common sight at the campground, as the wild dogs were often lured in by the smell of food. Most campers treated them as a nuisance, throwing scraps or shooing them away. Lindy watched the animal for a moment, noting how thin and bold it seemed. It was a reminder that despite the presence of other people and the comfort of the fire, they were still very much in the wild. A few minutes later, as the group continued their conversation, a short, sharp cry echoed from the direction of the tent. It was a sound Lindy recognized instantly, the cry of her daughter. She stood up and began to walk toward the tent, expecting to find Azaria simply fussing in her sleep. But as she got closer, she saw a dingo emerging from the front flap of the tent. The animal was shaking its head vigorously as if it were carrying something heavy, and then it turned and vanished into the total darkness of the scrub. Lindy dove into the tent, her hands fumbling for the bassinet in the dim light. Her fingers met only empty blankets. The panic hit her like a physical blow. She scrambled back out of the tent and let out a scream that would haunt the other campers for years. "The dingo has got my baby," she cried out, her voice cracking in the still desert air. Within seconds, the entire campsite was in a state of chaos. People grabbed flashlights and lanterns, fanning out into the darkness, calling Azaria's name and searching for any sign of the animal. The trigger event had happened in less than a minute. A massive search operation was launched that night, involving park rangers, local police, and dozens of volunteers. They spent hours scouring the red dirt, looking for tracks or fragments of clothing. Lindy and Michael sat by the fire, frozen in a state of shock that the police would later interpret as a lack of emotion. To Lindy, her faith told her to stay strong and trust in God, but to the investigators arriving from the city, she looked like a woman who had something to hide. The rising pressure of the investigation began almost immediately. Because Azaria's body was not found, the police started to look for alternative explanations. They were city people who didn't understand the desert or the power of a hungry dingo. They began to focus on the blood found inside the tent. There were only a few small spots on the bedding, which the police thought was too little for a predatory attack. They began to whisper that perhaps the mother had done something to the child and used the dingo as a convenient scapegoat for her crime. The media took these whispers and turned them into a national obsession. Lindy was vilified in the press. She was mocked for her religious beliefs, her choice of the name Azaria, which some claimed meant sacrifice in the wilderness, and most of all for her face. She did not cry on camera. she did not look like a broken woman. She looked like a woman who was holding herself together with a terrifying level of discipline. The public decided she was a monster long before she ever stepped into a courtroom to face a jury of her peers. The point of no return arrived when a forensic biologist named Joy Cool claimed to have found evidence of infant hemoglobin under the dashboard of the family's yellow Torana. She argued that the spray pattern indicated that Azaria's throat had been cut with a pair of nail scissors while she was sitting in the front seat. This evidence was the smoking gun the prosecution needed. It didn't matter that there was no motive, no weapon, and no body. The scientific certainty of the bloodstains was enough to convince a nation that Lindy was a killer. In 1982, Lindy Chamberlain was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison with hard labor. Michael was convicted as an accessory after the fact. Lindy was pregnant at the time of her sentencing and gave birth to her fourth child, Kalia, while in custody. She spent years behind bars, stripped of her children and her reputation, while the rest of Australia moved on. Satisfied that justice had been served, she remained steady, continuing to insist on her innocence, even when it seemed like the world had completely forgotten her. The aftermath of the trial was a long, slow period of suffering for the family, but in 1986, a redefining clue emerged that would shatter the prosecution's case. A British hiker named David Webb fell to his death while climbing Uluru. During the search for his body, rangers discovered a small weathered piece of fabric near a dingo lair in a remote area of the rock. It was a baby's matinee jacket, a garment Lindy had insisted Azaria was wearing over her jumpsuit, but which the prosecution claimed never existed. The jacket was found in an area where dingoes were known to den, and it was torn and stained in a way that was consistent with an animal attack. This discovery forced the Northern Territory government to order a fresh inquiry into the case. The final tightening of the evidence happened when independent experts re-examined the blood found under the dashboard of the Torana. Using more advanced technology, they discovered that the spray was not blood at all. It was a combination of a spilled milkshake and an acoustic sealant used during the manufacturing of the car. The climax of the story was the total collapse of the legal system's house of cards. The scientific evidence that had put Lindy in prison was revealed to be a series of catastrophic errors and technical incompetence. In 1988, the convictions against both Lindy and Michael were overturned, and they were officially exonerated. Lindy walked out of prison a free woman, but she was a woman who had lost 8 years of her life and her reputation to a myth fueled by media bias and forensic failure. The final truth revealed by the case was that a wild animal had indeed taken a child from a tent in the middle of the night. It took until 2012, more than 30 years after the event, for a fourth inquest to officially change Azaria's death certificate. The coroner finally ruled that the cause of death was being taken by a dingo. It was a total vindication for Lindy, though it came far too late to save her marriage or to return the years she had spent in a prison cell. Lindy Chamberlain today is a public speaker and an advocate for those who have been wrongly accused. She is still a woman of faith and a woman of order, but she carries the weight of a tragedy that changed the way an entire continent looks at justice. The case is now taught in law schools and police academies as a cautionary tale about the dangers of confirmation bias and the power of a narrative to override the facts of a case. It is a story about the cost of being different in a world that demands a specific kind of grief. The cold ending of the story is not found in the courtroom or the headlines. It is found in the stillness of the desert at 3 a.m. It is the sound of the wind moving through the salt bush and the high lonely howl of a wild dog echoing off the red walls of the monolith. It is the realization that in the deep heart of the outback, the wild does not care about the rules of man or the logic of a courtroom. It only cares about the quiet movement of a predator in the dark. One physical detail remains as a haunting afterimage of that night in 1980. It is the sight of a tiny blood-stained jumpsuit found in the dirt, its collar torn by teeth that were built for the hunt. It is a reminder that while the world was arguing about Lindy's face and her religion, the real killer was already back in the shadows. Invisible and indifferent to the lives it had destroyed, the red dirt of Uluru has long since covered the tracks of the dingo, but the silence of the desert remains. In the middle of a breezy April evening in 1981, in the small prairie town of Standard, Alberta, a 15-year-old girl named Kelly Cook, was in the middle of a completely ordinary situation. Kelly was the kind of person who was defined by her quiet ambition and a polite, steady nature that made her a favorite among the local families. That day, she was only sitting in her living room checking the laces on her figure skates and waiting for a ride to a new babysitting job she had accepted over the phone. Standard was the kind of place that felt like it had been preserved in amber. It was a tiny community of about 400 people situated on the vast flat plains of southern Alberta, where the sky is so big it feels like it might swallow the horizon. In 1981, it was a town where no one used their deadbolts, and keys were often left in the ignitions of pickup trucks parked outside the general store. It was a world built on the assumption that everyone was a neighbor, and every stranger was just a friend you had not met yet. Kelly Cook was a central part of that small-town fabric. She was a grade 9 student with a bright, easy smile and a mass of curly hair that she usually kept pinned back while she was training. Her life revolved around the local ice rink. Kelly was a dedicated figure skater, the kind of athlete who would wake up before the sun to practice her jumps and spins in the biting cold of the morning. She was not the most vocal girl in her class, but she had a presence that people noticed. She was reliable, kind, and possessed a maturity that seemed to belong to someone much older. Her family was well known and respected in Standard. Her parents, Marion and Jack, had raised Kelly and her siblings to be independent and hardworking. Their home was a place of constant activity, filled with the sounds of school projects and the planning of community events. Kelly was especially close with her younger sister, and she took her role as the eldest daughter seriously. She was the one who helped with the dishes without being asked, and the one who always made sure her skating gear was packed and ready for the next session. Babysitting was a natural extension of Kelly's personality. In a town as small as Standard, there were not many ways for a teenager to earn extra money, and Kelly was saving every cent she could for a new pair of professional skates. She had a reputation for being excellent with children, and her name was at the top of the list for most parents in the area. She enjoyed the work, and the families trusted her implicitly. To Kelly, a Friday night spent watching a toddler and doing her homework was a perfect way to reach her goals. The geography of Alberta in the early 80s played a significant role in the psychology of the town. The landscape is a grid of straight gravel roads and infinite wheat fields, punctuated by the occasional cluster of grain silos. It is a beautiful place, but it is also isolated. When you live in a town of 400, you become accustomed to the silence and the way a single set of headlights can be seen from miles away. This isolation usually felt like a warm blanket, a barrier that kept the troubles of the world at bay. On that particular Wednesday, the 20th of April, the phone in the Cook household began to ring. It was a man calling himself Bill Christensen. He spoke with a calm, polite voice that sounded like it belonged to a middle-aged professional. He told Marion Cook that he was new to the area and was looking for a babysitter for his 2 children for the evening. He claimed to live on a farm just outside of town and said he had heard through the grapevine that Kelly was the best sitter in Standard. This was the first small deviation in the normal flow of life in the village. Standard was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, yet no one had ever heard of a Bill Christensen. However, the man was so polite and seemed so knowledgeable about the town that Marion didn't feel any immediate alarm. He mentioned a few local landmarks and spoke with the kind of easy confidence that suggested he belonged in the prairies. Kelly was excited about the job, especially when the man offered her $9 an hour, which was an exceptionally high rate for the time. Later that evening, the man called back to finalize the details. He told them he would pick Kelly up at 8:30 and bring her back before midnight. There was a brief moment of hesitation in the house, a small flicker of parental instinct. Usually Kelly's father or a family friend would drive her to jobs. But this man insisted on providing the transportation himself, since he was already coming into town to run an errand. The offer seemed more like a courtesy than a demand, and since it was such a short distance, the family agreed. At exactly 8:30, a full-size sedan pulled into the Cook's driveway. The car was clean and nondescript, the kind of vehicle that blends into any parking lot. A man stepped out of the driver's seat and walked toward the front door. He was a white male, likely in his late 30s or early 40s, with a lean build and a polite, unremarkable face. He was dressed in a casual but neat manner, looking every bit like the father of 2 he claimed to be. He stood on the porch and spoke briefly with Marion, reassuring her that he would have Kelly home early. The trigger event happened in the time it took Kelly to grab her jacket and walk to the car. She gave her mother a quick wave, stepped into the passenger seat of the sedan, and watched as the man backed out of the driveway. Marion stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the red glow of the taillights as the car turned toward the edge of town. It was a scene that had played out 1,000 times in 1,000 different towns. A teenager going to work, a parent watching them leave, and the assumption of a safe return. As the car reached the outskirts of Standard, it turned onto one of the many gravel roads that weave through the wheat fields. For Kelly, this would have been a familiar sight. She knew these roads by heart. But as the minutes passed, and the car continued to drive further away from the clusters of farmhouses, she recognized a sense of unease would have started to settle in. There were no children in the back seat, and there was no farmhouse waiting at the end of the lane. There was only the vast, dark expanse of the Alberta prairie. Back at the cookhouse, the first sign of trouble arrived at 10 o'clock. Kelly had promised to call as soon as she arrived at the job to give her mother the phone number of the house, just in case of an emergency. When the phone didn't ring, Marion felt a sharp, cold spike of anxiety. She tried to tell herself that the children were likely busy, or that Kelly had simply forgotten. But by 10:30, the silence in the house had become deafening. Marion began to call the few families in the area who lived on the outskirts of town, asking if they knew a Bill Christensen. The escalating pressure chain moved quickly from concern to total panic. No one in Standard had ever heard of the man. The RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, were notified before midnight. Officers arrived and began the process of checking the address the man had provided. They quickly discovered that the location was a vacant field. There was no house, no children, and no Bill Christensen. The realization hit the community like a physical blow. Kelly had not been hired for a job. She had been lured into a trap. The point of no return was the discovery that this man had been incredibly calculated. The investigation revealed that earlier that same day he had called 3 other teenage girls in Standard using the same cover story and the same name. Each of those girls had turned him down because they were either busy or their parents had felt a sense of unease about the stranger. Kelly had simply been the 4th girl on his list, the one who happened to be available, and said yes. He had systematically hunted through the town's youth until he found a target. A massive search operation was launched the following morning. It was one of the largest in Alberta's history. Hundreds of volunteers from Standard and the surrounding towns joined the RCMP, forming long lines and sweeping through the sections of farmland. They searched every barn, every abandoned shack, and every coulée for miles. The flat landscape that usually felt so open now felt like a hiding place. The grain was still low in the fields, providing little cover, yet Kelly was nowhere to be found. Her skates remained in her room, a haunting reminder of the life she was supposed to be living. For 2 months, the town of Standard lived in a state of suspended animation. The fear was palpable. Parents stopped letting their children play outside, and the once open doors were now locked tight before sunset. Every white sedan was viewed with suspicion, and every stranger was treated as a potential monster. The RCMP followed thousands of leads, interviewing anyone who might have seen the car or the man. They created a composite sketch based on Marion Cook's description, but the face that stared back from the posters was maddeningly ordinary. On June 28, 1981, the search reached its tragic conclusion. 2 local fishermen were walking along the banks of the Chin Lakes Reservoir, a remote area nearly 2 hours away from Standard. They spotted something unusual in the shallow water near the shore. It was the remains of Kelly Cook. She had been bound and weighted down with cinder blocks and heavy ropes. A clear sign that her killer had planned the disposal of her body with the same cold precision he had used to lure her from her home. The aftermath of the discovery was a mixture of profound grief and a new, sharper kind of terror. The realization that a predator had been bold enough to walk right up to a family's front door and speak to a mother before taking her child changed the province forever. The autopsy provided little in the way of forensic clues due to the length of time she had been in the water. There was no DNA technology in 1981, and the cinder blocks and rope were common items that could be bought at any hardware store in Western Canada. A redefining clue emerged when a clerk at a convenience store in a nearby town remembered a man matching the description of Bill Christensen. He had come in on the day of the abduction and bought a map of the local area. He had been polite, calm, and had even made a joke about the wind. This detail suggested that the killer was not a local, but a drifter who had scouted the area and chosen Standard specifically because of its isolation and its trusting nature. He was a man who understood the geography of the prairies and how to disappear into the grid of country roads. The final tightening before the case went cold happened in the late 80s. The RCMP identified several suspects, including a man who had a history of similar predatory behavior in other provinces. They traveled across the country to interview him, but he had a solid alibi for the night Kelly vanished. Other leads were followed into the United States and as far away as Europe, but each one ended in a frustrating lack of evidence. The man calling himself Bill Christensen had vanished as completely as the dust on a summer road. The climax of the story is the enduring silence that has lasted for over 40 years. In a town of 400 people, a crime like this does not just go away, it becomes part of the soil. The children who grew up in Standard after 1981 were raised with a different set of rules than their parents. They were taught that the world was a place of hidden dangers, and that even the most polite stranger could be a wolf at the door. The loss of Kelly Cook was the loss of the town's innocence. The final truth revealed by the investigation is that Kelly was targeted not because of who she was, but because of her kindness and her reliability. The killer exploited the very traits that made her a pillar of her community. He used the town's own values against it, turning a babysitting job into a death sentence. The case remains one of Canada's most infamous cold cases, a permanent file in the archives of the RCMP, and a permanent hole in the hearts of the Cook family. The cold ending of the story is not found in a courtroom or a confession. It is found in the quiet, empty driveway of a farmhouse in southern Alberta. It is the sound of a car engine idling in the night air, and the sight of a set of red taillights disappearing into the vast black horizon of the prairie. It is the realization that somewhere out there a man went back to his life, carrying the secret of what happened on that gravel road, while a 15-year-old girl's skates stayed tucked away in a closet, never to touch the ice again. The only physical detail that remains is the weight of the cinder blocks found in the reservoir. They were common, gray, and heavy, designed to build things that last. In this case, they were used to sink the truth into the mud. The water of Chin Lakes is still and deep, and while the surface reflects the big Alberta sky, the bottom holds the memory of a night when a small town learned that the most dangerous monsters are the ones who speak with a polite voice and a smile. In the summer of 1980, on the shores of Lake Bodom in Espoo, Finland, a group of 3 19-year-old friends was in the middle of a completely ordinary situation. Arto, the leader of the group, was the kind of person who felt most at home when he was moving through the dense needle-carpeted forests of his homeland. That afternoon, he was only clearing a small patch of level ground to pitch a heavy canvas tent before the sun began its long, slow dip toward the horizon. Arto had grown up in the suburbs of Helsinki, but he was a child of the wild. He was a quiet, observant young man with the broad shoulders of someone who spent his winters cross-country skiing and his summers rowing across the thousands of lakes that define the Finnish landscape. He was the kind of person who didn't feel the need to fill the silence with talk. He preferred to listen to the wind in the pine trees and the lap of the dark water against the granite stones of the shore. His 2 friends, Jukka and Pentti, were different. They were louder, more focused on the music coming from their portable radio and the crates of beer they had lugged through the brush. But they looked up to Arto. He was the one who knew how to start a fire in the rain and how to tie a knot that wouldn't slip under pressure. In 1980, they were at that specific age where the world feels small and your own life feels infinite. They were looking for a place to be free. For most of his life, Arto had been the steady hand in his family. His father worked in a paper mill, and his mother was a school teacher. He was raised with the Finnish concept of sisu, a word that describes a specific kind of stoic determination and grit. If a task was difficult, you simply worked harder. If the weather was cold, you ignored it. Arto didn't believe in ghosts, and he didn't believe in bad luck. He believed in what he could see, touch, and measure. That summer day had been about as ordinary as it gets. The 3 of them had taken the bus from the city, carrying their heavy packs and their sense of adventure. They had walked the winding trails that lead to the shores of Lake Bodom, a place of immense natural beauty just west of the capital. The air smelled of pine resin, damp moss, and the clean, cold scent of the water. To Ardo, it was the perfect place to spend a weekend away from the noise of the growing city. Lake Bodom is a deep, clear body of water surrounded by thick forests of spruce and birch. It is a place that holds a permanent spot in the Finnish psyche, but in 1980, for a group of 19-year-olds, that history felt like ancient news. Exactly 20 years earlier, in 1960. 3 teenagers had been murdered in their tent on these very shores in a crime that shocked the nation and remained unsolved. It was the most famous mystery in the country. Arto knew the stories, of course. Everyone in Finland did. He knew about the 4 teenagers who had camped there in June of 1960 and how only one of them had survived a brutal midnight attack by an unknown assailant. He knew about the botched investigation and the thousands of leads that went nowhere. But to Arto, 20 years was a lifetime. He figured that whatever monster had lived in these woods in 1960 was either dead or long gone. He chose a spot on a small peninsula, a place where the trees opened up to give them a view of the water. It was a beautiful location, but it was also isolated. As Jukka and Pentti laughed and cracked open their first beers, Arto worked with a focused intensity. He drove the wooden stakes into the soft earth, tightened the guy lines, and made sure the tent was secure. He liked things to be done correctly. He liked the feeling of a well-made camp. The evening was typical of a Finnish summer. Because they were so far north, the sun never truly set. It just hovered near the horizon, casting a long golden light over the landscape that lasted for hours. It is a time the locals call the White Nights. The forest was filled with the sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of a squirrel in the undergrowth. There was no sense of danger, only the peaceful, heavy stillness of a summer evening in the north. As the hours passed, the 3 friends sat by their small fire talking about their plans for the fall. Jukka wanted to move to Sweden to find work, while Pentti was hoping to go to university in Oulu. Arto just wanted to stay in the woods. He listened to his friends and watched the shadows stretch across the water. He felt a deep sense of contentment. He was exactly where he wanted to be, doing exactly what he wanted to do. By midnight, the fire had burned down to a pile of glowing orange embers. The golden light of the sun had faded into a soft, silvery twilight. The air grew chilly, and a light mist began to rise from the surface of the lake, swirling around the base of the trees. Jukka and Pentti crawled into the tent, their voices muffled by the heavy canvas as they joked one last time before falling into a deep alcohol-fueled sleep. Arto stayed outside for a few more minutes, dousing the fire with lake water and making sure their supplies were covered. He stood at the edge of the water, looking out into the mist. The silence was absolute. There was no wind, and the lake was as smooth as a sheet of dark glass. He felt a brief, strange shiver crawl up his spine, but he dismissed it as the evening chill. He turned around, unzipped the tent flap, and climbed inside. This was the first small deviation from the normal track of the night. As Arto lay on his sleeping mat, staring up at the dark peak of the tent, he heard a sound. It wasn't the sound of an animal or the wind. It was the sound of a footstep, a single heavy thud on the soft earth just outside the canvas wall of the tent. Arto froze. He strained his ears, listening so hard that he could hear the rhythmic thumping of his own heart. He waited for a second step, but it didn't come. He told himself it was just the ground settling, or perhaps a heavy branch falling from a nearby tree. He looked over at Jukka and Pentti, who were both breathing deeply, completely unaware of anything. Arto closed his eyes and tried to force himself to relax. He was a man of logic, and logic told him that there was no one else on this peninsula at 1 o'clock in the morning. But then he heard it again. This time it wasn't a footstep. It was a soft, sliding sound like a piece of fabric being dragged across a rough surface. It was coming from the back of the tent near where Arto's head was resting. He sat up slowly, his muscles tensed. He reached for the flashlight sitting by his boots, but he didn't turn it on yet. He wanted to be sure of what he was hearing before he woke his friends and looked like a fool. The trigger event happened 10 seconds later. From the darkness outside, a long, sharp blade was suddenly pushed through the heavy canvas of the tent. Arto watched in stunned silence as the metal glinted in the dim twilight filtering through the walls. The blade didn't move quickly. It moved with a slow, deliberate pressure. It began to slide downward, slicing through the thick fabric with a sickening, rhythmic rasping sound. Arto finally found his voice. He shouted at the top of his lungs, a raw guttural sound that jolted Juka and Penty awake in an instant. He grabbed the flashlight and clicked it on, bathing the interior of the tent in a harsh white light. The beam hit the blade just as it reached the bottom of the cut. For a split second, Arto saw the knife clearly. It was a long, thin blade with a wooden handle, the kind of tool a fisherman or a hunter would use. As soon as the light hit the knife, it was yanked back through the slit in the canvas. The three boys scrambled toward the tent flap, their hands trembling as they struggled with the zipper. When they finally burst out into the night, the peninsula was empty. The silvery mist was still swirling around the trees, and the lake was as calm as ever. There was no sign of a person, no sound of running footsteps, and no rustle in the bushes. The escalating pressure chain began as they circled their tent with the flashlight. They found that the attacker hadn't just made one cut. There were 3 long vertical slashes in the canvas, placed exactly where the 3 boys had been sleeping. The cuts were clean and precise, showing that the knife was incredibly sharp, and the person holding it had been calm and controlled. The boys didn't stay to investigate further. They grabbed their boots and ran toward the nearest road. When they reached a phone and called the police, they discovered they weren't the only ones. Over the previous 2 weeks, multiple groups of campers at Lake Bodom had reported the same thing. People were waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of their tents being sliced open. No one was being robbed, and no one was being physically attacked. The perpetrator was simply cutting the fabric and then vanishing into the woods before the campers could react. The point of no return for the community arrived when the police released a report on the nature of the slashes. An investigator who had worked on the original 1960 case noted a terrifying detail. The cuts being made in the 1980 tents were identical in size, angle, and location to the cuts made in the tent of the murdered teenagers 20 years earlier. Someone wasn't just harassing campers. They were meticulously recreating the opening act of the most famous massacre in Finnish history. The discovery and first response turned Lake Bodom into a site of national panic. The local newspapers began running headlines about the return of the Bodom man. People started calling him the ghost of the lake. The police increased their patrols, sending officers into the woods with dogs and setting up checkpoints on the roads leading into the area. But the forest was too dense and the shoreline was too long. The slasher continued his work, moving like a shadow between the patrols. Aftermath and investigation revealed that the terror was purely psychological, but it was incredibly effective. The number of campers at the lake plummeted. The once vibrant recreation area became a place of whispers and fear. Arto and his friends were interviewed by the police, but they could provide no description of the attacker. They only remembered the sight of the blade and the sound of the canvas tearing. Arto, the man of logic, found that his sense of safety in the woods had been permanently shattered. A redefining clue emerged when a local man was spotted by a police patrol standing perfectly still in a thicket of spruce trees. He was holding a pair of high-powered binoculars and was focused on a group of hikers about 100 yards away. When the police approached him, he didn't run. He just stood there with a blank, flat expression. He was a local resident who lived in a small cabin not far from the lake. The final tightening before the climax happened when the police searched the man's cabin. They didn't find a bloody knife or a trophy from the 1960 murders. What they found was a collection of news clippings about the original case arranged in a neat chronological display on his wall. They also found a map of the lake with small, hand-drawn circles marking the locations of every tent slashing that had occurred that summer. He had been tracking his own handiwork with the precision of a scientist. The climax of the story was the interrogation. The man admitted to watching the campers for weeks. He told the police that he enjoyed the sound of the knife on the canvas because it made him feel connected to the history of the lake. He denied being the 1960 killer, claiming he was too young at the time, but he spoke about the original murders with an intimate, disturbing level of detail. He knew things that hadn't been released to the public, details that only someone who had studied the crime scene could know. The final truth revealed was that the man was never officially charged with the 1960 murders. There was no physical evidence to link him to the past. He was eventually institutionalized for the 1980 slashes, and the Bodom fever slowly began to subside. But the damage was done. The case highlighted how a historical trauma can stay dormant in the soil of a place waiting for a single person to reach down and pull it back into the light. Today, Lake Bodom is once again a place for recreation, but the atmosphere remains heavy. The peninsula where Ardo camped is now overgrown with thick brush, and few people choose to pitch their tents in that specific spot. The 1980 copycat scare is often cited as a footnote in Finnish folklore, a reminder of the summer when the woods became a theater for a man who wanted to play the part of a monster. The cold ending of the story is not found in a police file. It is found in the physical sensation of being inside a tent in the middle of a silent northern night. It is the sound of a sharp blade dragging slowly across heavy canvas, a sound that Ardo still hears every time he closes his eyes in the dark. It is the realization that the thin layer of fabric between you and the wild is no protection at all when the danger isn't an animal, but a person with a memory. One concrete physical detail remains for those who walk the trails around the lake. Sometimes in the early morning mist you can find a tree where the bark has been sliced in long vertical lines, exactly the length of a human torso. Some say it is just the weather or the movement of the ice in the spring, but the locals know better. They know it is the mark of someone who is still watching from the trees, waiting for the sound of a zipper. The case of the 1980 slasher reminds us that some mysteries never truly end. They just change shape and wait for a new audience. Ardo never went camping again. He spent the rest of his life in the city, surrounded by stone walls and locked doors, preferring the noise of the traffic to the absolute silence of a white night in the woods. He knew that in the forest, the most dangerous thing you can hear is the sound of someone else's breath. The silence of Lake Bodom is different now. It is a silence that feels intentional, as if the water itself is holding a secret that it isn't ready to share. The mist still rises from the surface every summer, swirling around the granite stones and the roots of the birch trees. And somewhere in the dark corridors of the pine forest, the image of a long, thin blade glinting in the twilight remains etched into the air, a permanent part of the history of the lake. Is the copycat still out there? No one can say for sure. But when the wind catches the flap of a tent and makes it flutter, the campers at Lake Bodom still reach for their flashlights, their hearts racing as they listen for the sound of metal on fabric. They know that in 1980, the ghost of the lake became a man, and the man had a knife. That is a truth that no amount of time can ever truly erase from the red dirt of Espoo. In the middle of the morning, on April 12th, 1981, in the remote mountain town of Katy, California, a 14-year-old girl named Sheila Sharp was in the middle of a completely ordinary situation. Sheila was the kind of person who was naturally responsible and observant, the eldest daughter in a busy, crowded household. That morning she was only walking the short distance from a neighbor's house back to her own family's cabin to change her clothes for church. The Sierra Nevada mountains were still shaking off the winter chill that April, and the air in the Plumas National Forest was sharp and smelled of damp pine needles and old wood. Sheila had spent the night at a sleepover in Cabin 27, just a few yards away from her own front door at Cabin 28. To her, this resort was the safest place in the world. It was a place where kids ran between the cabins without a second thought, and the biggest danger was usually a stray bear or a slippery trail. To understand why that walk was the last normal moment of Sheila's life, you have to understand her mother, Sue Sharp. Sue was 36 years old and had spent the last year rebuilding her life from scratch. She was a woman of immense resilience and quiet strength. After a difficult divorce in Connecticut, Sue had packed up her 5 children and driven across the country to Northern California. She was looking for a place where her kids could grow up with fresh air and a sense of community, far away from the complications of her past. Sue was a devoted mother who operated on a very tight budget. She didn't have much, but she made sure Cabin 28 felt like a home. She was the kind of person who could stretch a single grocery bag into a week of meals, and who kept her children's clothes clean and mended despite the lack of a washing machine. She was protective but fair, a woman who valued honesty and hard work. Her neighbors saw her as a quiet, private person who was entirely focused on her children's well-being. The move to Katy had been a gamble, but for a while it seemed like it was paying off. The resort was a collection of old wooden cabins that had seen better days tucked into a hillside overlooking a creek. It had a summer camp atmosphere that Sue loved. Her children were thriving. John, 15, was a social kid who loved the outdoors. Tina, 12, was full of life and energy. The younger boys, Rick and Greg, spent their days playing in the woods. It was the fresh start Sue had prayed for. John Sharp was especially happy in Keddy. He was at that age where he was starting to find his own way, often spending his time with his best friend Dana Wingate. Dana was 17 and lived in the nearby town of Quincy. The two of them were inseparable, often seen hitchhiking between the small mountain towns or hanging out at the local youth center. John was the kind of brother who looked out for his siblings, a steady presence in the house who helped his mother with the heavy lifting of the move. The layout of Cabin 28 was simple. It was a two-story wooden structure that had grown drafty over the decades. The living room was the heart of the home, where the family gathered to watch television or eat dinner. Upstairs there were small bedrooms with thin walls that did little to block out the sounds of the forest at night. It was a modest life, but for the Sharp family, it was enough. They had safety, they had each other, and they had a mountain to explore. By the spring of 1981, the family had settled into a comfortable routine. Sue was taking classes at a local college, trying to improve her job prospects while the kids were doing well in school. They were no longer the outsiders, they were part of the fabric of Keddy. They knew the shortcuts through the trees and the best spots to find wildflowers. Sue felt that she had finally found the peace she was looking for when she left the East Coast. On the night of April 11th, the atmosphere in the cabin was relaxed. Sheila had asked for permission to go to a sleepover at the Seabolt house next door, and Sue had agreed. John and Dana had spent the day in Quincy and were planning to hitchhike back to Keddy later that evening. The younger boys, Rick and Greg, were at home with Sue and Tina. They also had a friend over, a young boy named Justin Smart, who lived nearby. It was a typical Saturday night in the mountains. The first small deviation from the normal track of the night happened around 10 o'clock. A neighbor noticed that the lights in Cabin 28 were still on, which was unusual for Sue, who generally turned in early to get a head start on the morning. Around the same time, John and Dana were seen hitchhiking on the road leading into Keddy. They seemed to be in good spirits, laughing and talking as they made their way home. They arrived back at the cabin sometime before midnight and settled into the living room. What happened inside Cabin 28 during the early morning hours of April 12th is a sequence of events that defies logic and human decency. While the rest of the resort slept, a group of individuals entered the cabin. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting that either the door had been left unlocked or the intruders were someone the family knew. The violence that followed was not quick or clean. It was a prolonged, methodical nightmare that took place while three young boys slept in a bedroom just a few feet away. Sue, John, and Dana were the primary targets of the initial attack. They were bound with medical tape and electrical cords, their hands and feet secured behind their backs. The intruders used weapons found within the home, including a claw hammer and a steak knife. The level of brutality was extreme. Each victim was struck multiple times. The sound of the struggle muffled by the thick wooden walls and the rushing water of the nearby creek. Despite the intensity of the violence, none of the neighbors reported hearing a single scream. The point of no return for the family came when the intruders turned their attention to 12-year-old Tina. Unlike her mother and brother, Tina was not found in the cabin the next morning. She was taken from her bed, led out into the cold mountain air, and disappeared into the darkness of the forest. The motive for her abduction remains one of the most haunting questions of the case. She was the only one removed from the scene, a small girl in her pajamas taken into the wilderness, while her family lay broken in the living room. While this massacre was unfolding, the three younger boys, Rick, Greg, and Justin, remained in their bedroom. They would later claim that they slept through the entire event, or that they heard muffled noises they mistook for a dream. The door to their room stayed closed. For reasons that only the killers know, the children in that room were left untouched. They were the silent witnesses to a crime they could not comprehend, separated from a slaughter by nothing more than a few inches of pine wood. The discovery began at 8 o'clock the next morning. Sheila Sharp walked the short distance from Cabin 27 to her front door. She noticed that the house was unusually quiet. She opened the door and stepped into the living room, expecting to see her family waking up for breakfast. Instead, she was met with a sight that would remain burned into her mind forever. The room was covered in blood and three bodies were lying bound on the floor. The metallic, heavy smell of iron was overwhelming. Sheila didn't scream at first. The shock was too deep. She looked at the forms of her mother, her brother, and his friend, trying to make sense of the carnage. She then ran to the back bedroom and found the three younger boys who were just waking up. She hurried them out through the bedroom window so they wouldn't have to see the living room. Only then did she run back to the Seabolts, her voice finally breaking as she told them that everyone in her house was dead. The first response from the Plumas County Sheriff's Office was immediate but tragically flawed. The crime scene was not secured properly, and several people walked through the cabin before forensic teams arrived. Investigators were overwhelmed by the scale of the violence. They found 2 different hammers used in the crime, one of which had been bent from the force of the blows. They also found a steak knife that had been used so violently the blade had snapped off in one of the victims. The aftermath of the discovery was a period of intense pressure for the small community. As the news spread, the sense of safety that had defined Keddie evaporated. People began to suspect their neighbors. The focus of the investigation quickly turned to 2 men who lived nearby, Marty Smart and Bo Bubiday. Marty was the stepfather of Justin, the boy who had slept through the murders. He was a man with a violent temper and a history of conflict with Sue Sharp. Marty Smart had recently been involved in a dispute with Sue because she was encouraging his wife to leave him. He was a man who felt he was losing control, and Sue had become the focus of his anger. Bo Bubaid was a friend of Marty's with a long criminal record and ties to organized crime in Chicago. The 2 men had been seen at a local bar the night of the murders, wearing suits and acting erratically. Despite the heavy suspicion and several incriminating statements, neither man was ever charged. The redefining clue in the case did not come until 3 years later. In April of 1984, a man collecting aluminum cans in a remote area of the Butte County woods 30 miles away from Keddie found a human skull. It was confirmed to be the remains of Tina Sharp. The location of her body suggested that she had been killed shortly after being taken from the cabin. This discovery proved that the crime was not just a localized explosion of violence, but a planned abduction and execution. The investigation was plagued by ignored leads and what many believe was a deliberate cover-up. Marty Smart had a close relationship with the local sheriff, and he later wrote a letter to his wife that many interpreted as a confession. He told her that he had paid the price for her love, and that it had cost him the lives of 4 people. He even mentioned that he had disposed of one of the hammers in a nearby pond, a detail that was only confirmed decades later when the hammer was recovered. The final tightening before the climax of the case happened in the early 2000s. New investigators took over the file and began retesting evidence using modern DNA technology. They discovered that there were likely at least 2 people involved in the killings, and they were able to confirm that the suspects had used medical tape that matched tape found in Marty Smart's home. However, by the time this evidence was consolidated, both Marty Smart and Bo Bubede had passed away from natural causes. The climax of the story is the demolition of Cabin 28 in 2004. The building had become a site of dark tourism, a rotting monument to a crime that had never been solved. As the wooden walls were torn down and the foundation was cleared, the people of Keddie hoped that the memory of that night would finally fade. But for Sheila Sharp and her brothers, there is no such thing as moving on. They are the survivors of a nightmare that has no end. The final truth revealed by the case is that the legal system failed the Sharp family at every level. From the initial processing of the crime scene to the failure to arrest the primary suspects, the pursuit of justice was secondary to local politics and personal relationships. Sue Sharp moved her family across the country to find safety in the mountains, only to be betrayed by the very community she tried to join. The peace she sought was an illusion that shattered on a Saturday night in April. The cold ending of the story is found in the physical reality of the forest today. If you walk to the spot where Cabin 28 once stood, you will find only a flat, scarred patch of earth where the grass grows slightly different than the rest of the hillside. There is no marker, no memorial, and no explanation. All that remains is the metallic smell of old blood mixed with the scent of mountain pine and the sound of the creek rushing past the empty lot. The final physical detail of the night is the watch found on the wrist of one of the victims. It had been smashed during the struggle, and the hands were frozen at precisely 5 minutes past midnight. It is a reminder that time stopped for the Sharp family while the rest of the world kept moving. The forest has reclaimed the land, and the snow falls every winter on the clearing, covering the site of a tragedy that remains as cold as the mountain air. In the end, the story of Keddie is not just about a murder. It is about the failure of a promise. It is about a mother who did everything she could to protect her children, and a daughter who had to walk through her own front door and see the end of her world. The silence of the Sierra Nevada mountains holds the secrets of what happened in that living room, secrets that were carried to the grave by the men who walked into the cabin and out into history. In November 1980, in the heart of the sprawling, neon-soaked capital of Bangkok, Thailand, a 10-year-old girl named Lek was in the middle of a completely ordinary situation. Lek was the kind of person who took immense pride in being her mother's right hand. That Tuesday evening, she was only standing on a wooden crate behind a steaming noodle stall, carefully counting out small coins and wiping down plastic tabletops as the night market began to hum with the energy of the city. Lek was a child of the urban boom, a girl whose entire world was defined by the rapid, chaotic growth of a city that was reinventing itself every single day. She lived with her mother Malai in a small room tucked behind a labyrinth of narrow alleys, just a few blocks from the market. They were part of the thousands who had moved from the quiet rice paddies of the north to the loud, humid streets of the city, chasing the promise of a better life that the 1980s seemed to offer everyone. Lek was not a dreamer, she was a worker. She had the calloused hands and the watchful eyes of someone who had grown up fast in a world where nothing was free. Her job at the stall was vital to their survival. She was the one who remembered which regular customers liked extra chili and which ones wanted their broth served in a separate bag. She had a sharp mind for numbers and an even sharper ear for the gossip that flowed through the market like the muddy water of the Chao Phraya River. In the market, Lek was a fixture. The other vendors knew her as the girl who never complained and who always had a polite greeting for the elders. She moved through the crowded aisles with a grace that allowed her to navigate the sea of elbows and heavy baskets without ever being bumped. She felt a deep sense of belonging in the chaos. To Lek, the market was not a place of danger. It was a sanctuary of light and noise that protected her from the crushing loneliness of the big city. Malai, her mother, was a woman whose life was a series of calculations. She measured her success in the number of bowls sold and the amount of money hidden under the floorboards of their room. She was protective of Lek, but in a way that was practical rather than sentimental. She taught Lek that in Bangkok, you have to be faster than the person next to you and smarter than the person trying to sell you something. She looked at Lek and saw a mirror of her own determination, a girl who would one day own her own shop. The 1980s in Southeast Asia were a time of what people called white noise. It was the sound of constant construction, the roar of ancient buses, and the high-pitched chatter of thousands of people trying to climb the economic ladder all at once. For the families living in the hubs of Bangkok and Manila, the noise was a sign of progress. It meant there were jobs, there was money, and there was hope. But the noise also provided a perfect cover for things that were happening in the shadows of the skyscrapers. The market where Lek and Malai worked was a microcosm of this boom. Every night it was flooded with construction workers, office clerks, and tourists, all moving in a frantic, disjointed rhythm. The air was a thick soup of charcoal smoke, fermented fish sauce, and the sweet, heavy scent of jasmine garlands. It was a sensory overload that made it impossible to focus on any one thing for more than a second. In this environment, a child was just another moving part in a machine that never stopped. Lek's routine was ironclad. She would arrive at the stall at 4 o'clock, help her mother set up the heavy pots, and then work straight through until midnight. She enjoyed the rush of the evening when the heat finally began to break and the lanterns were lit. She liked the feeling of being useful, of contributing to the house. She had a favorite spot behind the stall where she kept a small plastic doll she had found in the street, a silent companion that sat among the bags of rice and watched the world go by. On the night of November 12th, the market was unusually crowded. A local festival was taking place nearby, and the overflow of people had pushed the stalls even closer together, narrowing the walkways to a point where two people could barely pass each other. Malai was busy with a long line of hungry workers, her hands moving in a blur as she blanched noodles and ladled out broth. Lek was busy too, taking orders and making sure the condiments were topped up. The heat from the burners was intense. This was the first small deviation in the normal track of the evening. Around 7 o'clock, a man dressed in a clean white shirt and dark trousers approached the stall. He didn't order food. Instead, he leaned over the counter and spoke to Lek in a soft, polite voice. He told her that his daughter had dropped her toy just a few stalls down and asked if Lek could help him find it since she was small and could move through the gaps between the tables more easily than he could. Usually Lek would have looked to her mother for permission, but Malai was currently embroiled in an argument with a customer over the price of a side dish. Lek looked at the man. He seemed kind, and he had the appearance of someone who was successful, someone who belonged in the new modern version of Bangkok. He smiled at her, a smile that didn't reach his eyes but felt reassuring nonetheless. Lek thought about her own doll and how upset she would be if she lost it. The trigger event happened in the time it took Malai to turn her back to grab a fresh bag of noodles. Lek stepped out from behind the stall, her small feet in their worn sandals, hitting the damp pavement. She followed the man in the white shirt as he moved toward the edge of the market where the lights were thinner and the noise of the construction began to drown out the music from the festival. She told herself she would only be gone for a minute, just long enough to find the toy. The man led her into a narrow gap between two large warehouses that were being renovated. The space was filled with stacks of timber and bags of cement. The white noise of the city was even louder here, the rhythmic thudding of a pile driver echoing off the brick walls. The man pointed toward a dark corner and told Lek the toy was just behind a stack of crates. As Lek stepped further into the shadows, the man moved behind her. He didn't say a word. Back at the stall, Malai finished her transaction and reached out to hand Lek a stack of dirty bowls. Her hand met empty air. She looked down at the wooden crate where Lek usually stood, but her daughter was not there. At first, Malai wasn't worried. She assumed Lek had gone to the communal tap to wash the bowls, or was perhaps talking to the vegetable vendor across the aisle. She continued to serve the customers, her eyes scanning the crowd every few seconds for a flash of Lek's bright yellow shirt. The escalating pressure chain began to tighten when 10 minutes passed, then 20. Malai stepped out from behind the stall, ignoring the shouts of the waiting customers. She walked to the water tap, then to the other vendors she knew. "Have you seen Lek?" she asked, her voice rising in pitch. Everyone shook their heads. They had been too busy with their own customers to notice a 10-year-old girl walking away. The market was a sea of moving bodies, and Lek had simply been one more ripple in the water. The point of no return for Malai arrived when she found Lek's plastic doll lying in the dirt behind the noodle stall. It had been knocked over, its small glass eyes staring up at the lanterns. Lek never went anywhere without that doll. Malai let out a cry that was swallowed by the roar of a passing bus. She began to run through the market, pushing people aside, screaming her daughter's name. But the noise of the city was too loud and the crowd was too thick. The search that followed was a desperate, disorganized effort. The local police were notified, but in 1980, their records were entirely paper-based, and their resources were focused on the political unrest in the north. To them, a missing girl from a night market was a common occurrence. They told Malai that Lek had likely run away or had been taken by a relative. They didn't understand the bond between the mother and daughter, and they didn't care about the silent pattern that was emerging across the region. Aftermath and investigation revealed a terrifying reality that had been hidden in plain sight. Lek was just one of hundreds of children who had vanished from the busy urban centers of Southeast Asia during that 2-year period. In Bangkok, Manila, and Jakarta, children were disappearing into the white noise of the boom. They were being taken from markets, from construction sites, and from outside schools. They were the victims of a transnational organized crime ring that exploited the lack of digital footprints and centralized records to delete children from the world. The signature of these removals was always the same. The children were taken during periods of high activity, lured away by a polite stranger, and vanished without a single witness seeing them leave. They were not being taken for ransom. They were being moved across borders to be sold into labor or illegal adoptions. In the 1980s, once a child was moved across a national line, they effectively ceased to exist in the eyes of the law. They became ghosts in the machine of the global economy. A redefining clue in Lek's case emerged months later when a street vendor near the warehouses reported seeing a white sedan parked in the shadows on the night of the festival. He remembered a man in a white shirt leading a small girl toward the car. But by the time the police followed up on the lead, the man was gone, and the car had long since been repainted or sold. The paper trail ended at the edge of the market, leaving Malai with nothing but a plastic doll and a stack of dirty bowls. The final tightening of the tragedy is the scale of the uncounted. For every case like Dorothy Jane Scott or Katrice Lee that made international headlines, there were thousands of children in the developing world who vanished without a single line in a newspaper. They were the collateral damage of a world that was moving too fast to look back. Their families were left to mourn, in a silence that was even louder than the noise of the city that had taken their children. The climax of the story is the enduring hollow space left behind in the lives of the families. Malai continued to work the noodle stall for 20 more years, always keeping a wooden crate in the same spot, always watching the crowd for a yellow shirt. She grew old in the shadows of the skyscrapers that Lek had once helped her build. The city became taller, brighter, and even louder, but for Malai, the heart of Bangkok was a silent, empty gap where a 10-year-old girl used to stand. The final truth revealed is that the 1980s were a golden age for the predator. It was a time when you could disappear a human being with nothing more than a polite voice and a car. There were no cameras, no mobile phones, and no way to track a life once it had been taken off the grid. Lek and the thousands of children like her were not lost. They were removed, their futures stolen to fuel a market that operated in the darkness behind the neon lights. Today, those files are mostly lost or destroyed, buried under decades of bureaucratic changes and urban redevelopment. The warehouses where Lek was last seen have been replaced by luxury malls and high-speed rail stations. The night market is still there, but the lanterns are electric now, and the vendors use digital apps to take payments. The white noise of the 1980s has been replaced by the digital hum of the 21st century, but the gap in the crowd remains. The cold ending of the story is found in the physical sensory memory of the night market. It is the smell of the charcoal grill and the sight of a sudden silent space between two people in a shifting crowd. It is the realization that in the middle of 10,000 people, you can still be completely alone. Lek's name was never written in a history book, but her story is told every time a mother in Bangkok reaches for a hand that isn't there. One concrete physical detail remains for those who know where to look. In a small, quiet temple on the outskirts of the city, there is a wall covered in tiny, faded photographs of children who never came home. Among them is a grainy picture of a 10-year-old girl standing on a wooden crate, her eyes full of the pride of a worker and the hope of a child. The picture is yellowed with age, but the gaze of the girl remains steady, a silent witness to the cost of the boom. The silence of the uncounted is a weight that the region still carries. It is a reminder that the most successful crimes are the ones that are never reported, and the most enduring tragedies are the ones that happen in plain sight. Lek walked out into the dark and never came back, and the city simply kept building. Its noise drowning out the only thing that ever truly mattered to a woman named Malai. The white noise of history has a way of covering the tracks of the lost. Intellectual humility is the quiet recognition that our knowledge is inherently limited and our perspectives are colored by bias. In a world that prizes certainty, admitting we might be wrong feels like a radical act of rebellion. Yet this very admission is the bedrock of true wisdom. It allows us to move beyond our existing silos and engage with the world as it actually exists today. We live in an era characterized by an unprecedented abundance of data, yet we are often less informed than ever. This paradox arises because we mistake access to information for the mastery of it. Having the world's libraries at our fingertips does not automatically grant us discernment. Without humility, we simply use this data to fortify our own errors rather than expanding our minds at all. One of the greatest obstacles to learning is the illusion of competence. The Dunning-Kruger effect illustrates how those with the least expertise often possess the most confidence. This psychological trap prevents us from seeking information we lack. By maintaining intellectual humility, we can bypass this bias and remain open to the complex nuances that true experts eventually understand. Humility is not just an internal cognitive state, it is a social necessity for healthy discourse. When we enter a conversation, assuming we have nothing to learn, we are not communicating, we are lecturing. A valuable educational message is that listening is as vital as speaking. True dialogue requires the vulnerability to let another person's perspective challenge our deeply held beliefs. The concept of a growth mindset popularized by Carol Dweck relies heavily on the principles of humility. If we believe our intelligence is fixed, we see every mistake as a personal failure to be hidden. However, if we view ourselves as perpetual students, we can embrace challenges as opportunities. This shift in perspective transforms the classroom of life into a place of discovery. Science itself is a monument to the power of being wrong. Every major breakthrough began with the realization that a previous theory was incomplete or entirely incorrect. Scientists do not seek to prove themselves right, they seek to falsify their own hypotheses. This rigorous commitment to truth over ego is what has allowed humanity to unlock the secrets of the stars and the atom. In the digital landscape, algorithms prioritize engagement by showing us content that confirms what we already believe. This creates digital echo chambers, where our biases are constantly reinforced. Breaking free from these circles requires the humble effort to seek out dissenting voices. We must be willing to sit with the discomfort of being contradicted to find a better common ground. We often treat failure as an ending, but in education it should be treated as data. Every failed experiment and every incorrect answer provides a roadmap for what to try next. Intellectual humility allows us to detach our self-worth from our performance. When we are no longer afraid of being wrong, we are finally free to experiment with the bold ideas that lead to genuine innovation. Critical thinking is the practical application of intellectual humility. It involves questioning the sources of our information and the motivations behind our own reactions. It is the process of asking how we know something is true, rather than how we can prove we are right. This educational message teaches us to be the architects of our own minds, rather than passive consumers of media. The world is not a collection of simple binaries, though our brains often wish it were. Most issues are layered with complexity that defies easy categorization. A humble observer recognizes these layers and resists the urge to provide oversimplified answers. Acknowledging that we don't have a solution to every problem is not a sign of weakness, it is a sign of profound honesty. In the workplace, leaders who admit their limitations are often far more effective than those who project absolute authority. Humility fosters a culture of collaboration where every team member feels empowered to contribute. When a leader admits they do not have the magic answer and asks for help, they build trust. This openness leads to robust problem solving and a healthy environment. History is littered with the wreckage of empires built on the certainty of their own superiority. Those who refused to adapt or listen to dissenting voices eventually found themselves obsolete. The educational value of history is in showing us that no perspective is permanent. By studying the past with humility, we avoid repeating the same arrogant mistakes that led to previous collapses. Cognitive rigidity is often a source of immense personal distress. When we are unable to change our minds, we become trapped in cycles of anxiety and resentment. Intellectual humility provides the psychological flexibility needed to navigate life's transitions. By accepting that our current understanding is temporary, we can better cope with the unexpected shifts that life brings. Even the most accomplished experts must remain humble to stay relevant. The more we know about a subject, the more we realize how much remains undiscovered. This is the paradox of expertise. Profound knowledge leads to a deeper appreciation of the unknown. Truly great thinkers are defined not by the answers they provide, but by the better questions they are constantly asking today. Our relationship with the natural world requires a massive dose of humility. For centuries, we have operated on the assumption that we can dominate and control the Earth's ecosystems. The current climate crisis is a harsh educational message about our interconnectedness. Recognizing our place within the system, rather than above it, is essential for our survival as a global species. Creativity is an act of humble exploration. An artist starts with a blank canvas or a silent room, admitting they do not yet know what the final product will be. They must be willing to make bad art to eventually reach something meaningful. This willingness to be messy and uncertain is what allows the human spirit to express things that logic and data simply cannot capture easily. Being a responsible citizen involves the humble acknowledgement that our personal interests are part of a larger whole. It requires us to consider how policies affect people whose lives are vastly different from our own. Education should teach us to step outside our own shoes and look at the world through the eyes of the vulnerable. This is where true justice and humility finally meet. The ultimate goal of education is not the acquisition of a degree, but the cultivation of a lifelong habit of learning. This habit cannot exist without the humble belief that there is always something more to see. Whether we are 18 or 80, the world remains a vast classroom. Intellectual humility ensures that our minds stay sharp and our spirits remain curious and engaged. In our closest relationships, the ability to say we were wrong is more valuable than any grand romantic gesture. Humility allows us to see our partners as they are, rather than as we want them to be. It creates a space for mutual growth and forgiveness. When we prioritize the relationship over our need to be right, we build bonds that can withstand any amount of external pressure. If we want to build a better future, we must change how we talk to each other. We need more curiosity and less condemnation. The educational message of intellectual humility is that everyone we meet knows something that we do not. If we approach every interaction as a chance to learn, we can begin to heal the divisions that currently tear at the fabric of our global community now. Intellectual humility is not about lacking confidence. It is about having the confidence to be uncertain. It is a commitment to the truth that outweighs our commitment to ourselves. In the end, the most valuable lesson we can learn is that our perspective is just one thread in a much larger tapestry. Embracing this reality is the first step toward living a life that is truly wise.